So this week we take on the topic of births and deaths. As usual, we'll be focused on how stress plays a role in this, but this is going to be a week where we think about all of the things we've talked about: physical health, psychological health, stress, and how these things are differentially influenced by socioeconomic status, how health behaviors plays a role. It all sort of comes together in this week in a big way. And this is one of my favorite topics, and not because I really like really depressing stuff, but I think it's extremely interesting and a very, very important topic. So for this week, you'll be reading an article by Liu and Halfon. It was written in 2003, so it's a little bit old now, but it gives a really nice overview of issues in the field. So it takes on the broad topic of racial and ethnic disparities in birth outcomes. Within that, you'll see the authors talking about low birth weight and very low birth weight as one adverse birth outcome, infant mortality, another, and preterm birth. Preterm birth, that is when babies are born early. That's also associated with low birth weight, very low birth weight, and infant mortality. And what they do in this article is present a systematic literature review of the scientific research about this topic. And they bring together a variety of theories that have been proposed and tested and refined. And then together they pull it together to really propose this theoretical framework, in the idea that disparities in birth outcomes are the consequences of differential developmental trajectories that happen both as a result of early life experiences and accumulation of experiences over time. Now, I do want to caution you to not personalize the things that you read in this article and the other materials that you'll encounter this week. It is a very sensitive topic, I believe. We're thinking about babies that are very frail, babies that die, and things like that. And we're talking about racial and ethnic disparities. I want to be very clear with you. If you're misreading, then you may be thinking that the authors here are suggesting that there's something negative about one group or another, and that's certainly not what's going on. They are drawing on what overall has been the body of scientific evidence and thinking. And when I say thinking, theories get tested in scientific research, and through the process of research, those theories get refined, or they get thrown out if they don't seem to work out to be supported by research. So again, there's nothing personal here. There's no blaming. There's no bad feelings about the groups and things like that. And I think you'll get a really good sense of that, if you don't already, when you watch the film for this week. So disparities in birth outcomes, this is one of the most persistent health disparities, in particular the gap between African Americans and whites in terms of birth outcomes. As with many of the things that we've read, scientists believe that it is most likely a very complex process that has a number of biological, behavioral, psychological, and social factors at work, rather than some single cause linking a person's race to their birth outcomes. One of the common explanations here is socioeconomic status. On average, African American women have lower socioeconomic status than white women. Again, these are averages. This is the average or typical usual experience for the population as a whole. And lower socioeconomic status is typically associated with worse birth outcomes. Any given individual with low SES may have very fine birth outcomes, and any given individual with high SES may have very poor birth outcomes. But again, we're thinking about on average across the population. But what research shows is that race differences are seen even after taking socioeconomic status into account. So here we have evidence that SES matters for birth outcomes, but it's really only part of the story for thinking about these racial disparities in birth outcomes, right? Again, the idea that there's not going to be a single cause. This matters some, but it's only part of the story. Same holds true for health behaviors. Health behaviors, though, are a popular explanation. We Americans really like being able to point to something somebody did wrong and saying, well, there you have it. But on their own, risky health behaviors do negatively affect pregnancy outcomes. And here we might think of things like cigarette smoking during pregnancy, drug and alcohol use during pregnancy, and so on. Most evidence finds that Black women are not any more likely than white women in the population to engage in these behaviors. Um, so while risky health behaviors during pregnancy do matter for negative birth outcomes, the role in driving these racial disparities in birth outcomes is very small. It's very modest. Prenatal care, again, we see here that if for women who have delayed prenatal care or who have inadequate prenatal care, they can experience poor birth outcomes. But the evidence suggests that even taking this into account does not close the race gap. In terms of the role of maternal stress, right, something we've been thinking mostly about in this class, it's definitely a growing explanation, and thinking about maternal stress, that is the kinds of stress that women are exposed to during the time they are pregnant, right? The authors start talking about this early on. These explanations in the beginning of the early part of the paper are sort of going through and building their argument broadly for why we shouldn't just focus on what happens during the time of pregnancy. In terms of how being stressed out during pregnancy can matter for birth outcomes, this works through hormone production and release in the body that may cause something like preterm labor to happen, through effects on immune function, which can lead to a number of different consequences for the developing fetus in utero, and through, as we've talked about before, some health behaviors to cope with stress. Again, evidence does not consistently demonstrate a relationship between poor birth outcomes and stress experienced during pregnancy, though there's a lot of reason to suspect that this is playing a part. Again, what the authors are focused on in the front part of this paper is setting us up to understand how research has been, at least up until 2003, so heavily focused on what happens while a woman is pregnant during that period of 9 months or less in the case of preterm births, and how that may be underlying or driving these racial disparities in birth outcomes, because the authors then want us to move on and consider a much broader way of thinking about this. When you get to the sections on methods and results, I do recommend you skim through these to get a basic idea, but please don't get hung up on the details. We want to pull some big ideas out of what is a long and probably rather complicated paper for you to read. So then they get into this idea, the early programming mechanism, right? Mechanism, it's the mechanics, how stuff is working here. And the idea of early programming is that the body is exposed to things early in life, in utero through childhood, and that these things are programming it for what will happen later in life. And there are a number of studies that support this idea of early programming in terms of how in utero experiences linked to later adult health outcomes like diabetes and such, that the authors talk about. But in terms of how it matters for reproductive outcomes, the linkage is still very theoretical. There aren't any human studies to demonstrate that this is necessarily working, that our reproductive potentials are programmed through our in utero and early childhood experiences. Another explanation here, another proposed mechanism, the cumulative pathway mechanism, sounds very much like some stuff we've talked about before, cumulative adversity. The cumulative pathway mechanism is this idea that wear and tear adds up over time to affect health function, right? That we get exposed to these things over the course of our lives, especially when we're disadvantaged, when we're subject to inequalities in society, and that these things accumulate to negatively affect health. Um, Here, the biological mechanisms are not well understood, but we've heard some about allostatic load before, and that comes up again as something that can really matter for reproductive outcomes. Within that cumulative pathways mechanism section, they talk about the weathering hypothesis. And this is a theory that was proposed by a woman named Arlene Geronimus at she's at the University of Michigan, following a series of studies that she did on low birth weight and very low birth weight. And the basic idea here is that disadvantaged African American women are exposed to chronic stress and strains, and these things wear out the body, so that the effects of those experiences are as important, if not more important, for birth outcomes as what the woman is exposed to during those months that she is pregnant. So again, the authors here are working to really synthesize all of these ideas into one theoretical model, because evidence and theory do suggest that these very early exposures matter, that the accumulation of exposures matter, and that maternal experiences tend to matter. So they put it all together into this model that they draw out to try to give us a visual on this black-white gap in birth outcomes, and how from age 0 on the left side through life this could start to differentiate to create the gap where risk factors are really pushing down what they're calling reproductive potential, the likelihood that you're going to have to not have a preterm birth, to not have a low birth weight baby, and to not have a baby who dies within the first year of life. And so you can see the arrows are really pushing down on the potential for African American women. That is, they're exposed to all of these risk factors throughout their life. Of course, white women are too, and those things will matter at different periods of the life course. But you see the imbalance where white women, their reproductive potential is being pushed up by a number of protective factors throughout their life course, while African American women have fewer protective factors really working in their favor in this society. And then they go into a couple of sections, a couple of pages here where they really talk through applying this life course framework to rethinking, to re-examining the studies that they have reviewed for the purposes of this paper, and take a look at that. But I think that some of the most important stuff, and I believe the most interesting stuff for some of you, are the implications that they talk about toward the end. They talk about implications for research, and research is really important here because it can identify effective targets for substantially reducing, if not eliminating, disparities in birth outcomes. And this is something that we as a society do have as a goal, certainly, right? And, you know, this person can say, well, I really think it's about stress, and I really think it's about health behaviors, and I really think it's about prenatal care. And we can think whatever we want, but if we're going to put resources, money, time, energy into developing programs and policies that are really going to reduce these birth outcomes, evidence is our best source of information on what things we can focus those programs and policies around to really help reduce and eliminate these disparities in birth outcomes. They also talk about implications for practice here, right? Clinical practice, public health interventions, how women can be protected more, or ways that we can reduce adverse exposures before pregnancy, right? That's what the authors really want us to focus on, including things like Head Start in early life, different interventions during puberty and other sensitive developmental periods, access to quality health care, what they say, from womb to tomb, because again, there's evidence that our exposures in utero, right, what happens to our mothers when we are developing fetuses, can matter. And then finally, implications for policy, and they name a number of these, and these are very broad, far-reaching policies that would generally improve the health of disadvantaged populations in our society, but that would certainly go a long way to reduce health disparities in birth outcomes and protect the most vulnerable.